Chapter 53, Part 2. All right, so when we look at a community, its three-dimensional structure also affects the species that live there and the ways they interact. So, for example, look at this image of a forest. Some of these plants are going to grow tall. Some of them are going to be on the forest floor. Some of them are going to form a canopy. There's going to be short trees and shrubs and vines and so on. And so this habitat structure is going to allow the species to specialize. Some of them might move into the canopy. Some of them might live in the understory. Some of them might live in the herb layer. So the point is that the growth forms of plants will help determine the community's overall composition. I mean, compare this to, like, I don't know, the tundra, where there aren't really many plants. There's just lichens and mosses. So you don't have as many habitats. So without this robust three-dimensional structure on the tundra, you're going to have fewer animals and fewer interactions. So the structure of a community is in part determined by its plant structure. When we measure plant structure or animal structure, we might want to measure a couple of different metrics. So one is species richness. So species richness is just the total number of species that live somewhere. The relative abundance is just how common they are. Some species will be dominant species. So in other words, they're exceptionally numerous or large. And then species diversity is just the richness and relative abundance calculated together to get an overall feel for how many species are represented. So if you look at the three graphics at the bottom from your book, we can see three forests represented. So in Forest A, we have moderate species diversity. So what's our richness? How many species are represented? Well, I count 4. All right. We could calculate relative abundance. So how many purple ones are there relative to the other ones? I don't know. There's only one purple one and there's a bunch of other ones. So it's going to have low abundance. So species richness just doesn't take how many of each species there are. It just sums the total number of species. And so the species diversity is going to be moderate. 4 different, 1, 2, 3, 4 different species-ish represented in Forest A. Look at Forest B. Forest B, we've got 4 species represented as well. Or no, we've got more than that actually. Relative abundance is going to be about the same. So in other words, there isn't really a dominant species in Forest A. That this green looking guy is dominant. And then in Forest C, we have low species diversity. There's just 2 species represented, and they're about 50-50 each. So maybe 2 dominant species there. So anyway, every community is structured a little differently, and these metrics help us keep track of that. Sometimes we say a species is a foundation species, and we define that as, or the book defines that as, a species that defines the nature of a community by creating a stable environmental condition. So as an example, consider this guy right here. This is salt marsh cordgrass. And so when it's when it's found living on the edge of where the ocean meets the land, its roots stabilize the ground and basically helps support it, keeps it from getting eroded away. So it's a foundational species. So when it's present, it provides stability, and this is kind of hard to interpret, but when it's present in large numbers, then it affects the distribution of plants around it. And when it's in low numbers, smaller patches, then there's fewer other plant species around. So anyway, the point is, cordgrass is an example of a foundation species because when it's around, it stabilizes the environment, it provides more habitat, and it leads to greater diversity. And when it's absent, then you have a more unstable environment and you have less diversity. Let's look at the interactions in a community and put some names on these different levels or layers. So there are predator herbivore interactions, there's competition between herbivores, and so on and so forth. And so we can divide these up into a hierarchy of trophic levels. So a trophic level is the feeding relationships among species. So we can see here in this graphic, each of these, not columns, each of these rows is a trophic level. And there are different types of animals and plants, photosynthetic critters, that inhabit each of these trophic levels. Let's start at the bottom and work our way up. So at the bottom, we have primary producers. So primary producers are the organisms that are undergoing photosynthesis and are basically trapping the sun's energy, and this is the source of all the energy in the ecosystem. So that the sun's energy flows into the primary producers. They use it to make glucose and other stuff that provides an energy source for the upper layers. So above the primary producers, we have the primary consumers. Wait, do I not? So I guess I define that on the next slide. My bad. The primary consumers are eating the primary producers, and then the secondary consumers are eating the primary consumers, sorry. The tertiary are eating the secondary, and so on and so forth, all the way till we get to our top carnivore, in this case, a killer whale. So consumers are eating producers or eating other consumers. Consumers are anybody that's eating somebody else. Autotrophs are the primary producers. Autotrophs are anybody that's undergoing photosynthesis. Here it is displayed as a pyramid. So the pyramid shape is signaling how many species and how many individuals there are in each layer. So if your primary producers, that's your most common. When you walk through the woods, you're going to see tons of primary producers. You're going to see lots of plants. The next largest category is your primary consumers. So most of the animals that you see are going to be eating plants. So they're mostly herbivores. So you're going to see plenty of grasshoppers and caterpillars, for example. Then next most common is your secondary consumers. So your birds and your frogs, they're eating your primary consumers, and then your tertiary and then your quaternary. So the point is, the energy is coming in at the producer level, and they have direct access to the energy. So the majority of the animals represented or organisms represented are going to be producers, followed by primary consumers and secondary consumers and tertiary. And the higher up you go among your trophic levels, the animals become more and more rare because there's less energy available to them. You can also see that we can use these categories, I'm sure you've heard of them before, in order to categorize the animals according to what they're eating. So omnivores are eating plants and animals. Detritivores are eating rotting stuff. So are decomposers. And then heterotrophs are the opposite of autotrophs. The last slide we had autotrophs that are making their own food through photosynthesis. Heterotrophs are eating everything else. So your primary producers are autotrophs, and all of your consumers are heterotrophs. We can also illustrate these trophic levels through food chains and food webs. So food chains are linear. So a couple of examples. So here's our producer, here's our primary consumer, here's our secondary consumer. So this is a food chain. So if there's more corn grown, there's going to be more rats. If there's more rats, there's going to be more owls, and vice versa. Food webs are like food chains, but they're just a little bit more robust. So you link a couple of food chains together, and you can see all the different interactions. So the corn is eaten by a grasshopper, the grasshopper is eaten by a rat, the rat is eaten by a snake or an eagle or a wolf. And so the food webs just display all the different interactions among trophic levels. Food chains are a little bit more simplistic. Food webs are a little bit more complicated, and the food web is a better representation of what's happening in the ecosystem. Different food webs have different levels of stability. So typically the more links there are, the more stable the ecosystem. So here we've got two examples. So here's our initial food web. So we got 4 different plants that are eaten by 3 different types of herbivores with 2 different predators. Here we've got 4 plants, 3 herbivores, and 2 predators, but they're all eating each other, so there's more links. What happens if, I don't know, hunters come along and cause predator A to go extinct? Well, in this food web, the loss of predator A means that this herbivore population is going to grow because there's nothing eating it, and that can lead to some problems. With more of these herbivores around, there's less of this food available, so you get a big shift in your community composition towards these species of plants. In this example, or in this food web, Predator A also goes extinct, but because Predator B is also eating this herbivore, you don't see a big shift in your community. So different species have different roles and different levels of impact in a community, and the number of interactions in a community are going to help determine how stable it is. So therefore, we can classify some organisms as keystone species. So a keystone species is basically a species that has a greater effect on community structure than their numbers might suggest. All right, so let's break down what the term means, and then I'll give you an example. So when in the olden days, if you're building an archway out of bricks or rocks, the middle one is a keystone. So in other words, this keystone is really important. If you remove the keystone, this whole archway collapses. If you remove some of these other stones, then the archway might be affected, but it doesn't risk collapse. So a keystone species is similar. A keystone species, if you remove it, it's going to have dramatic impacts on your community structure. So the example is an elephant. An elephant is a keystone species in the savanna. And so while the elephant isn't the most abundant species in the savanna, it's perhaps the most important for maintaining the community structure of the savanna. Okay, so the reason for that is elephants like to feed on plant leaves. So you can see that this elephant is doing that. It's eating some plant leaves, but sometimes it can't reach the upper branches. And so elephants are pretty strong and big, and they just knock the tree over. So when they knock the tree over, it lets them eat the leaves that were at the top of the tree that they couldn't reach with their trunks. The result of this is that elephants maintain the community structure of the savanna. If you removed all of the elephants, then nobody would be knocking over the trees. And if nobody's knocking over the trees, you're going to get more trees growing. And if you get more trees growing, then your savanna is going to convert to a forest. So an elephant is a great example of a keystone species. The book talks about starfish. So to illustrate that, or not starfish, to illustrate another example of keystone species, let's look at this food chain. So we've got, originally off the coast of California, we had kelp that get eaten by urchins, sea urchins, and the urchins get eaten by sea otters. Well, when humans killed all the nearby seals in a seal population, the killer whales switched their diets and they started eating more otters. So as the killer whales ate the otters, there were fewer otters, and with fewer otters, it meant there were more urchins, and with more urchins, it meant there was less kelp, and you saw this collapse in the community. So you could say that the otters are a keystone species here because they're helping, when they're removed, then the community undergoes big shifts and you see a reduction in the amount of kelp. Can you hear that sound in all these videos? It's my chair. It's really creaky, so I apologize for that. All right, also in communities, we see disturbances that will pop up from time to time. So a disturbance is anything that disrupts the composition of a community. So a disturbance could be a hurricane or a tornado or a fire or a disease outbreak or whatever. And so this is really complicated. Let's not talk about it. Let's just go on to this. So imagine a community, and this is a cheesy illustration I stole off Google, but it's pretty helpful. So here's our community. So we got a nice forest. You can imagine an East Tennessee forest with trees and bushes and so on. And then a disturbance comes. In this case, it's a fire. So the disturbance kills off this community. It burns it up. And so now our community is different. Now our community is like bare ground. So what's going to happen next? Well, you're going to get weeds move in, plants that undergo, that grow quickly and make a lot of seeds, and maybe their seeds are distributed by the wind. So if you remember when we talked about R and K selected species, maybe a bunch of R selected species move in. Over time, you're going to get some plants and shrubs growing, and these are going to start to shade out the weeds. And pretty soon you get a forest again, but initially the forest is maybe oaks and pines. The pines grow more quickly, so initially it's pines, but then the pines don't live as long, so Eventually, the long-lived oaks take over and our community looks like it did in the beginning. So this process of community change following a disturbance is called succession. And so there are two types of succession. There's primary succession and there's secondary succession. Primary succession is when a disturbance basically hits the reset button and it destroys everything. A fire usually isn't primary succession. Usually, like a better example would be a glacier. A glacier is an example of primary succession because when a glacier moves through an area, it kills everything. It scrapes away the topsoil, it crushes everything to death, it blocks the light. And so under a glacier, you don't really have any living species. But as after the glacier melts, you undergo those stages of succession with small plants and then eventually a forest. So this is an example of primary succession. Secondary succession is when a disturbance affects the community, but it hits the reset button, but not quite as hard. So a fire is an example of secondary succession. It burns up this community, but it doesn't kill everything. There's still seeds and maybe some bacteria and fungi living in the soil. So secondary succession, you're not starting from scratch. The community is regrowing based on the species that were able to survive the disturbance. The process of succession goes through predictable community structures. So this is very predictable. Weeds, shrubs, pine trees, oak trees. And if a fire burns through, it's going to go through those same steps of succession again. The end of the succession process ends with a climax community. So this is the climax community, and that means that once the climax community is established, then succession stops. There's no community that's going to come in and replace our oak forest. So disturbances start succession, and succession ends when we reach a climax community, and the climax community is going to be present until another disturbance comes. So as an example, in East Tennessee, if a fire was to burn through the forest, we'd get weeds, and then shrubs, and then pines, and then we'd get oaks and maples and hickories, and that's our climax community. That forest would become an old growth forest and would be established until another disturbance wipes it out. My neighbor is putting a new roof on their house. Can you hear all the noises in the background? It's pretty annoying. So what's interesting is, as a community undergoes these stages of succession, there's different, in this case, animal species that are adapted to the various stages of succession. So a disturbance comes along, we get a bare field, then we get weedy grassland, then we get shrubs, and then a pine forest, and then oak hickory. And in each case, there's different bird species that are adapted to those different stages of succession. So when it's weeds and shrubs, you get sparrows. When it's forest, you get cardinals. When it's a climax community, we get wood thrushes and hooded warblers. So the point here is it's natural for communities to change and for succession to take place. And in fact, it's needed. You need disturbances like fire in order to start the process of succession, because these species are relying on the various stages. In other words, if a community stays in the climax community, so let's just say we put out all the forest fires and there's no oak hickory, and the oak hickory forest stays, the structure of the community remains the structure of the community for a long period of time, then that means the community isn't going to have grassland and shrubs and pine forest, and the warblers and the sparrows are going to miss out. All right, so that leads to the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. This hypothesis says that an intermediate frequency and intensity of disturbances will maximize species diversity. All right, in other words, if the intensity of this disturbance, or let's go with time, if there's a long period of time before there's another disturbance, then we reach our climax community and we're not going to have that much diversity. If our community keeps getting disturbed every couple of years, a fire burns through every couple of years, then it's just going to remain grassland and shrubs, and so we're not going to get the species that are associated with the pine forest and the oak forest, so species diversity is low. But if the rate of disturbance is an intermediate level, not too long, not too short, then we're going to be able to undergo all of these phase changes, and all of these different species are going to be represented at different times. So the intermediate disturbance hypothesis says we want, in order to have the greatest amount of species diversity, we need disturbances, but disturbances shouldn't be too frequent or too infrequent. They should be at an intermediate level. And it's the same with disturbance intensity. So if there's a high intensity disturbance, like a glacier, then that's gonna, or if there's a low intensity disturbance, like a lame forest fire, then that's not going to achieve as much diversity as if the disturbance is of an intermediate level. I hope that made sense. If not, see the book or ask me questions at the Zoom. Again, the point is you want disturbances at an intermediate time interval or an intermediate intensity level in order to maximize diversity. All right, finally, there is the equilibrium theory of island biogeography. So this is an attempt to explain variations of species richness on islands of different sizes and different levels of isolation. So this looks really complicated. Let me just go here. Imagine there's a mainland. Let's say this is South America and there's some finches on the mainland. And then let's say we get some islands that pop up just off the coast of the mainland. We get a big island and a small island, and they're both near the mainland. And then we get an island, two islands that are far away. So a big island that's far away and a little island that's far away. Well, what types of diversity can we expect on these islands? Which of these four islands would you expect to have the greatest amount of species diversity? The answer is this one. All right, so this big island, because it's big and because it's close to the mainland, means that it's going to have high immigration rates. You're going to have lots of species that are coming over to this island that's nearby. Right? And it also means that because the island is big, there's lots of resources available in different habitats, so you're going to have low extinction rate. So high immigration and low extinction means high diversity. Compare that with this big island that's far away. Or no. Let's compare it to this small island that's far away. Because it's far away, it's going to have low immigration. I mean, that's because it's going to be infrequent or rare for a species to make it from the mainland to this distant island. And because it's small and it has fewer resources available, it's going to have high extinction. So this island is going to have the lowest species diversity. These two islands are going to be somewhere in between. This little island that's close to the mainland is going to have high immigration because it's near, but it's going to have high extinction because it's small. So it's going to have less diversity than this one, but more diversity than that one. This island is far away, but it's big. Because it's far away, it's going to have low immigration, but because it's big, it's going to have low extinction. So these two islands are going to have similar diversities, with this one being the highest and this one being the lowest. That's what these graphics are trying to show, just in a more confusing form. Right? So, community composition is the result of all the different interactions between species, competition, predation, herbivory. Trophic levels help keep us organized, and food webs help us study the interactions between the trophic levels. Disturbances can change species composition. And then in islands, the size of the island and the distance of the island from the mainland will affect diversity. All right, I hope all that was clear. If not, see me in the Zoom. We can talk about it. One more chapter to go, y'all.